In a darkened radar room on the border between the United States and Canada, on a snowy November night in 1953, a young operator leans toward the green glow of his scope. 2 points of light drift across the glass. One is a United States Air Force fighter jet with 2 men inside. The other, something no one can identify. The operator watches the gap between the 2 blips shrink, mile by mile, sweep by sweep, and then, as the men in that room stare, the 2 points of light touch. They merge into one. The single blip drifts on for a moment. Then, the scope goes clean, and the fighter jet and the 2 men inside it are never seen again. This isn't a campfire story. It's right there in the accident files of the United States Air Force. The date was November 23, 1953. The plane was an F-89 Scorpion, call sign Avenger Red. The men were First Lieutenant Felix Moncla and Second Lieutenant Robert Wilson. And what their government said about that night: it would change 3 times, be denied by another country, and end with a leaked line from a radar man that's never been explained. "It seems incredible," he said, "but the blip apparently just swallowed our F-89. This is the story of Avenger Red. Stay with me to the end." It begins with a warning light over one of the most protected places in America. The Soo Locks at Soosaynt, Michigan, are the gateway of the Great Lakes, the narrow channel through which the iron ore of a continent flows. In 1953, at the cold height of the Cold War, the airspace above them was restricted, watched around the clock by Air Defense Command radar. That Monday evening, around 6 o'clock, in falling snow, a radar controller saw something he shouldn't have seen. An unidentified target inside the restricted zone, moving over 500 miles per hour. No American flight was scheduled there. No Canadian flight was scheduled there. Whatever it was fast, it was in forbidden sky, and it was nobody's. The alert went out to Kinross Air Force Base 20 miles away. In the alert hangar sat an F-89 Scorpion, a heavy, twin-engine interceptor built for exactly this. And its crew that night were 2 young officers from Louisiana and Minnesota. The pilot was Felix Moncla, 27 years old, called Gene by everyone who knew him. A schoolteacher's son from the little town of Manasoro, with more than 800 hours in his logbook. Behind him sat Robert Wilson, the radar observer, whose job was to find the target on the jet's own scope and guide his pilot the final miles. At 6:17, they were rolling. Minutes later, the Scorpion was climbing into the snow over Lake Superior. Call sign Avenger Red, chasing a point of green light. The chase lasted half an hour. On the ground, the controllers vectored them west, then northwest, out over the black immensity of the lake. It's the largest body of fresh water on Earth, 500 feet deep, and November cold. In the back seat, Wilson had a problem. He couldn't hold the target on his radar. Kept changing course, slipping off his scope, hiding in the storm. So the ground talked them in, sweep by sweep, calling the turns, watching the 2 blips converge. The jet came down from high altitude, steered towards 7,000 feet, closing on the unknown at better than 500 miles an hour, 70 miles off Kewina Point, far from any shore in darkness and snow. And then, the moment, on the ground scope, the 2 blips slid together and became one. The controllers weren't alarmed at first. In an intercept, this is normal. The fighter closes, the returns overlap, and a moment later they separate as the jet slides past its target. They waited for the blips to split. They never did. The merged return drifted on briefly along its course. The jet's identification signal, the electronic heartbeat that says a friendly aircraft is here, vanished from the system. The radio calls went out. Avenger Red, come in. Avenger Red. Nothing. Then the scope emptied entirely. One other F-89 pilot, sent out to search that night, would later testify he thought he heard a fragment of a transmission some 40 minutes after, a ghost of a voice. And then, nothing more ever. The search that followed covered 29,000 square miles of lake and shoreline over 5 days. American aircraft, the Coast Guard, the Royal Canadian Air Force, all of them combing the water in the wake of the storm. A crashed jet leaves a signature. Fuel sheens on the surface. Debris floats. Life rafts, cushions, oil. they found nothing at all. Not a rivet, not a drop of fuel. 2 men and 18 tons of aircraft had gone into a lake, if that's where they went, and the lake showed no mark of it. And then the story began to change. And this is where the case turns strange. In a different way. The Air Force's first statement to the press said their jet was followed on radar until it merged with an object 70 miles off Keweenaw Point. Merged with an object. Their word. Days later, that statement was pulled back and replaced. Now, the official account said the radar man had misread his scope. Nothing had merged. In fact, the jet had completed the intercept, identified the unknown as a Royal Canadian Air Force C-47 transport 30 miles off its course. And then, flying home, the pilot had likely suffered vertigo and crashed into the lake. There was one problem with the new story. Canada said no. The Royal Canadian Air Force stated, repeatedly over years in writing, that no Canadian aircraft was over the lake that night, that no interception of any Canadian plane took place. Decades later, the pilot of the very flight the Air Force had named looked into a documentary camera and denied it flatly. Nobody intercepted him. Nothing happened. Meanwhile, Uncla's young widow received 2 official visits. One officer told her that her husband had flown too low identifying the Canadian plane and struck the water. A second officer, sent by some tangle of the bureaucracy, told her the jet had exploded at high altitude, nothing to recover. 2 men in uniform, 2 condolences, 2 completely different deaths. And when civilian investigators later asked the Air Force's own Technical Intelligence Center about the case, the answer was stranger still. There is no record, they were told, of any sighting at Kinross on November 23, 1953. The chase that scrambled a fighter and killed 2 men had, on paper, quietly ceased to exist. So let's turn the lights on and be fair to the ordinary explanation because it's a strong one. Start with the night. It was stormy, snowing, black, over freezing open water, among the worst conditions a pilot can face. Vertigo over a dark lake is a killer, the same spatial disorientation that's taken thousands of airmen. And the aircraft itself deserves scrutiny. The F-89 Sea Scorpion was, by 1953, a troubled machine with a record of structural and engine failures. Moncla's own squadron had lost aircraft after aircraft that year. In fact, on that very same day, hours before Avenger Red took off, another F-89 from the same squadron crashed near its home field in Wisconsin, killing both crew. 2 Scorpions from one squadron, lost on one day. Seen that way, Kinross isn't a mystery. It's a bad airplane in bad weather, flown hard at low altitude, meeting the lake. The merge on the radar scope could be nothing more than the jet passing its target at the instant something failed. And Lake Superior is infamous for keeping what it takes. It's deep, cold enough to hold bodies down, and it's swallowed whole or freighters without a trace. A scattered jet in 500 feet of black water might simply never be found. In 1968, aircraft parts did wash up on the lake's eastern shore, confirmed military, possibly from the missing Scorpion, though their identity was never published. And the famous 2006 story of divers finding the intact F-89 on the lake bed beside a mysterious teardrop object? That one was a hoax, invented, debunked, its authors vanished. That's the sober case, and it may well be the truth. And yet, the sober case can't explain why the Air Force's story changed 3 times. It can't explain why Canada, the supposed other half of the intercept, has denied it for 70 years without wavering. It can't explain 2 officers telling one widow 2 different deaths. It can't explain records that vanished, or a case file that says the fighter and the bogey merged, no blips ever broke off, and the target itself was never aware of any aircraft in the area. Those words are from the official report. And it can't explain the sentence that leaked from the men who were actually watching the scope that night. The one the Air Force never repeated and never retracted. It seems incredible, but the blip apparently just swallowed our F-89. 2 young officers climbed into the snow over the largest lake on Earth to look at something that shouldn't have been there. Their radar return touched it and became it and was gone. The lake gave back nothing. The record gave back contradictions. Somewhere under that cold black water, or somewhere else entirely, is Avenger Red. And on some radar scope 70 years ago, for one sweep of the beam, 2 points of light became one, and only one of them ever flew away.